New Zealand, and unfortunately, they didn't go for it, but I think in hindsight, they wish they had. I am going to enter. Please help me out here. As I'm doing the obligatory uh, issue with IT that must accompany
It's
every presentation. It's got to be done, and I'm doing it so that we get it out of the way. So wonderful. Let's see if I can share my screen, and
yep,
that
should
should
be fine.
do it. Does that work?
Uh,
Is that coming through?
Now let me double check that. I will unshare. Okay, we should be getting there now.
Okay, let me. So I
Right,
think I've
we'll
got the
try again.
permissions to now. You're still not seeing anything, is that correct?
I am not. Let me try that one. Try one more time. Sorry.
Okay, all right. Let's see if this does it. Um, Screen share, come on. Nothing then, huh? It says your screen sharing is paused. Believe it or not, this might be on your end, not mine. Maybe
Um,
I'm,
Let me have
maybe I'm
a
pre.
double check. Um, Let me change all my settings again for you. Analyst at a time. Started screen sharing. Uh,
Maybe if you were to give me co-hosting
yep,
permissions and then I could screen share.
let me grab that one for you. Apologies, folks. we will we will get there. Oh, there we go. We've got you now.
Okay, probably
Oh.
the wrong screen. There we go. What are you, your screen sharing is paused again. Resume share. Hmm. Still no luck on your end, eh? I think you may have had it. I just could we
We
repeat that process?
have it. Let us go one more time. Host and panelists, one at a time. Okay, we'll try that one now.
Okay, okay, and screen share one more time. Great,
Beautiful. We've got you. Fantastic
fantastic.
stuff.
So I do adore New Zealand. I'm so pleased to be invited to speak to dedicated people in the field of education and in my little world to the field of dyslexia or neurodiversity. Um, I wanted to give you sort of an overview of what I intend to share, and this is not so much for your sake as much as mine, because like a good dyslexic, I can often go off track. So I'm going to try to remember what it is that I'd like to say and accomplish. But this is just a rough overview. To start with the beginning, my story is a bit long-winded, but it only gives you relevance as to why I do what I do, and I think it does underscore the importance both on a personal level and on a larger level. But it really begins with the fact that as a 51-year-old, I had an enormous benefit of being diagnosed with dyslexia in the mid to late 70s. And that is a very progressive timeline for anybody that is in the field. They understand that even, a diagnosis full stop rarely happens today, let alone at an age appropriate time, and certainly not in the 70s, as was the case with me. The reason I had that benefit was because I have a mother who's a child developmental psychologist, and my father, now deceased, was diagnosed dyslexic. So there was a level of awareness that allowed them to recognize what it was that I was struggling with and going through, and subsequently to get me the diagnostic tools that I needed in order to yield an appropriate diagnosis, and then the structured literacy and intervention that I required as a person with dyslexia to acquire the skill of reading. And when you think about it, reading is actually a skill. It's an acquired skill. It's not innate. It's not like speech or seeing or hearing. It actually is a human invention because at some point we attached a visual cue, a bunch of squiggly lines to a sound, and that was meant to comprise what is the invisible, the spoken word, and make it visible. Now, for one reason or another, the dyslexic brain does not synthesize these cognitive requirements in such a way that makes that process of learning how to read as easy as it does for everybody else. Now, why that is, or the sort of the neurological underpinnings, is still a bit of a mystery, still a bit contested. But that process of learning to read, which I was given the benefit of getting the proper instruction, still was marked by a process of internalizing the narrative that I was born deficient. I was born broken. I was stupid. These sort of labels that I placed upon myself because I couldn't help but to recognize that when I was being extracted from the normal classroom to be tinkered with in the small room with the small desks and the small chairs, and then reintegrated, and everyone kind of hoped with fingers crossed that I would somehow be normalized. That process uh, struck deep in my heart. It impacted the formation of my self esteem in a very, very profound way. Um, the reason I share this is part to point out the fact that, having had the benefits that I did, which are quite frequently regarded as the panacea for dyslexic learners, that identification, diagnosis, structured literacy, or reading intervention. And juxtaposing that against the fact that even despite having those advantages, I still wound up with a very malignant self esteem. I try to highlight the fact that this equation, as is often put forward in the field of dyslexia, the diagnosis and intervention will automatically equal an empowered individual, is not the complete equation. There's a vital variable in that equation that is often ignored, and that's something that I'd like to speak to you about this morning. And it's quite apropos based on the seminar as well as the center's work. So, I equate much of the experience of a person with dyslexia in a neurotypical mainstream classroom as acquiring what Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1980s termed learned helplessness. And I'm sure many in the audience understand learned helplessness, the experiment with the dogs, the temporary paralyzing agent, the electrified section of the lab, the safe section of the lab, and the fact that the dogs eventually would give up that sense of control despite when that temporary paralyzing agent wore off, and they were now mobile, they still would fail to overcome that small barrier separating the safe from the electrified section. Now, what I find so fascinating about this experiment, beyond the obvious, is the fact that Seligman and his team ultimately determined that the way for the dogs to regain that sense of control, to overcome that learned helplessness marked by that belief that no matter what they did, they could not control their outcome, was for the lab technicians to physically pick the dogs up and with their paws mimic the behavior of stepping over that barrier into the safe space. And I think that's so vital. It's that intervention, that interaction between the lab technicians and the dogs, and physically showing them the skill that they had temporarily lost in order for them to regain that ability to do so. I'm underscoring that because it's really the underpinnings of so much of what I'm about to share. Now, I discovered that as I was progressing towards through school, I was demonstrating periodically, and by periodically I mean certain academic years over others, was that sense of learned helplessness in a human manifestation, that low self esteem, which unfortunately was a fairly consistent belief and feeling, that frustration, those poor motivation moments, months, or years in some case, marked by procrastination and a turn inward, a failure to ask for help, a lack of self advocacy. And in my story, I was lucky enough to decide at a very pivotal moment as things were kind of headed downward that I was going to rebuff the assumption that people were placing upon me. I was going to essentially control the one variable that I could, which was when I got home after school at 5 p.m. every day, I would work consistently through midnight on homework, maybe taking a half an hour to wolf down some food. But it was that variable in this equation that I could manipulate, but most specifically, I could manipulate without being perceived as doing so by others. If everybody saw how hard I was working, they'd say, oh, you see, you're so dumb. That took me a half an hour. It took you 3 hours. But because I could do it behind closed doors, I was able to sink my energy, time, and efforts to produce the results that I wanted to in the classroom, but without perpetuating the stigma that I was placing upon myself or that my peers, or in some cases teachers, were placing upon me. Now, I was able to score the grades that I needed in order to gain admissions to a very competitive college, our equivalent of university, small liberal arts college. And the great irony was getting into this college was a moment of what I am going to call disputation. Again, this will come back later in my presentation this morning. I received this letter of acceptance from this college, and for the first time, I was receiving evidence that was counterintuitive to my perceived belief that I was stupid. This was a competitive college that had no obligation, no quota to accept a bunch of dumb kids, and I just happened to be the one that made the cut. To the contrary, this was a competitive university college that had their choice of the best students in the United States, and they chose me first. That disputation was the crack in the armor of my low self-esteem, my malignant self-esteem. It allowed me to introduce a sense of dissonance between the belief that I was useless and the belief that perhaps I had value. Now, I went through this college. I studied something that fascinated me, but not the greatest pre-professional degree. It was a philosophy of religion, and decided that after graduating, I was going to teach myself business. I was intrigued by business and entrepreneurship, but I certainly wasn't going to take more entrance exams and try to go to a professional business school because it was just going to be another arduous 3 or 4 years. So I bought this tiny restaurant on a resort island off the coast of Massachusetts, and I really had no business doing so. I'm drinking a ginger beer tonight, and I would have been hard pressed to open this bottle and pour it in a glass. That's how little hospitality industry experience I had. But there was something that attracted me to the visceral, tactile nature of learning as I built something, as I was going. And I didn't know it at the time. Thank goodness I didn't. But apparently, 60% of people that actually know what they're doing fail in the restaurant business in the first 3 years. And here I was, 23, with a philosophy of religion degree, going into a business that I was woefully ill prepared for. What I soon discovered was through my ability to observe human behavior, how I was observing the trends within the hospitality industry at that time, I was able to incorporate insights into this little restaurant and actually attract individuals, to retain customers, to build a business, much in the way that my seasoned professional colleagues were struggling with. Now, the other part of the restaurant business, as we all know, is it's absurd hours. And they say, oh, 80, 90-hour work weeks. Well, for a dyslexic, that's sort of I was now expected to do 60 hours a week. I had been doing 60 hours since I was about 14 years old. So that wasn't daunting. I had that tenacity to stick with a project, and that lent itself to surviving and then ultimately thriving in a business that I really shouldn't have been in. Long story short, I wound up selling this business 5 years later at a little profit and kind of stuck it in my back pocket as yet another moment of disputative evidence, contrary evidence to my assumption that I was indolent, stupid, or useless. So I eventually fell in love with a woman with dyslexia, and she became pregnant, gave birth to our little purebred dyslexic, my son Bodhi. And as Bodhi was born, this is Bodhi, I started to look into dyslexia because I had this moment of both euphoria and the shocking realization that I was about to send my child into an educational system that had the same detrimental effects, could potentially have the same detrimental effects on him as it did on both me and my wife. And as I started to look into dyslexia from more of an academic perspective, I was quite terrified by some of the results I started to find. I recognized through various sources that upwards of 60% of adolescents in the United States involved in drug and alcohol abuse have a learning disability, dyslexia being the most pronounced and prolific of those, or the most ubiquitous of those learning differences. And some estimates put us at upwards of 50% of adolescents involved in juvenile justice, incarceration. And these sent that cold realization through my body that what I was dealing with as I was sending my son into school was not just a matter of self-esteem, but was putting him on the front lines of potentially being exposed and acquiring the learned helplessness that I felt. And I postulated that it was learned helplessness that ultimately led individuals to make the life choices that ultimately accumulated or culminated into these outcomes that you're seeing here. And for the first time in my life, I realized that there was a very significant risk that I would be taking if I was passive or even complicit in sending my son into an educational system without being proactive and incorporating some of the insights that I had learned through my personal experience about how dyslexia could be advantageous. So I started to question, what was it that allowed certain individuals to thread the needle, to identify that there was a way forward and a way beyond learned helplessness to become proactive and self advocating and ultimately find a result in life other than the ones I shared with you. And this is when things got really interesting. I, until recently, lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the home of MIT and Harvard. And I was told by a colleague that there's this joke at MIT that there are so many people with dyslexia there that they call it the MIT disease. Now, this is arguably the most competitive engineering university in the world, bar none. And it is chock full of people with dyslexia. I also saw that 40% of self made millionaires were dyslexic, or like me, 35% of all entrepreneurs have dyslexia. And if you're talking about even the highest estimate of 20% of the global population having dyslexia, you can, by comparison, recognize that these statistics are disproportionately high, as are the negative outcomes. So I started to drill down on that question of what was the distinction in the narrative between those who wound up pursuing and ultimately finding success and those who acquired that learned helplessness and who started to inadvertently engage in a cascading effect of bad choices that led them to negative outcomes. And I stumbled once again on Martin Seligman, who had apparently gotten depressed. I mean, I'm saying that facetiously, but clearly studying learned helplessness for so many years, he must have either gotten bored or depressed and decided that he wanted to determine what it was that allowed people to become immunized, for lack of a better word, against learned helplessness and acquire what he ultimately termed learned optimism. Now, until that point, I had thought that optimism was an innate trait. You were an optimist or a pessimist, et cetera, et cetera. But it turns out that optimism is an acquired trait that can be self taught or taught through instruction. Now, he built upon Albert Ellis's work, and Albert Ellis, who was in many ways the person who sort of dipped the toe and started the movement behind cognitive behavioral therapy, he recognized this ABC model that when individuals are faced with adversity, they generate a belief about that adversity. They essentially tell themselves a narrative around that adversity. So if you take me as a dyslexic, for example, and I'm in sixth grade and I get my first essay back and it's nothing but red marks and a big F on the top, that is the adversity I face. Now, the belief that I tell myself is, this proves how stupid I am. What is the consequence? I start internalizing this belief that I'm stupid. It feels pervasive. It is personal. It is my fault. I'm dumb. I can't do anything. The consequence inevitably translates to loss of motivation, loss of investment, and so on and so forth in this downward spiral in my thought and processing of my self perception. Well, Seligman discovered that if we can, as individuals or teaching young people this process, if we can insert in that adversity, belief, consequence sequence, a form of disputative evidence. So I say, okay, I may have gotten an F on this essay. However, I know that I didn't have spell check available to me and I'm dyslexic. I know that it was a circumstance with which I had additional spelling mistakes because I didn't have my assistive tools available to me. Therefore, it is not pervasive. It's not personal. It was a circumstance and it was a bummer for sure, but it wasn't perpetual. It wasn't something that was going to haunt me and therefore force me to conclude that I innately am worthless. But in those circumstances, I miss the I miss I'm trying to think of a Kiwi analogy. I don't know cricket well enough to know I miss the wicket. And that's probably not the right word. That's terrible. Forget I didn't say that. Just trying to be culturally sensitive. Okay, so I swung and missed. That's what we say in America. So that disputative evidence actually allows me to 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 take away from the severity of this ABC sequence. It allows me to instill just enough doubt into this conclusion, which is negative and pervasive, and actually find just enough temporary relief to get back on the horse, to have another at bat. So tempted to do another cricket analogy. But what I find interesting is that there is something that two authors in a book that I'm about to share with you came up with, which was another form of disputation. And as much as I honor and kiss the ring of Martin Seligman and Albert Ellis, I actually think that their ABCDE model can be taken in a slightly different, more one step further insofar as when it applies to the individual with neurodiversity, in my case, dyslexia, that those adversity, belief, and consequences are inherently going to result in our early education in very pessimistic outcomes. That's that learned helplessness sort of sitting on our shoulder. But instead, that disputation, in this case with with Martin Seligman's lab technicians, when they pick those dogs up and they move their paws over that barrier, or in my case, when I got that acceptance letter from the college that I went to, or when I was actually able to sell my restaurant in a business that many fail in, I would attest that that disputative evidence can take on a much larger form, that it can put into balance or put into perspective the very real challenges associated with dyslexia, but counterbalance it with disputative evidence that is energizing to the point where I start to recognize how truly gifted and capable I am. And so the book that I'm referring to is called The Dyslexic Advantage. Brock and Fernette Eide are colleagues, friends, advisors. And if this isn't a book you've read, I strongly encourage you to do so, because these MIND strengths are essentially a cognitive profile that they have developed after interviewing thousands and thousands of people with dyslexia. And what emerges is a series of abilities, of advantages that accompany that unique brain construction that makes the acquisition of reading so difficult, but on the flip side, gives us, I want to be light in the use of the word superpower, but I will certainly use gifts or strength that allow us to see and do things that others can do, but not to the extent we can. The other fascinating thing about this book is that they have something called the 700 Club. In the United States, we have this barbaric, antiquated achievement test called the SAT. It's required to get into university or college. The top score is 1,600. You get approximately 500 or 600 points for filling in your name correctly. The 700 Club and the Dyslexic Advantage is a group of global entrepreneurs and CEOs, all of whom have dyslexia, who scored 700 or less on their SATs. And the authors ask these individuals, with all due respect, what was it that allowed you to change the trajectory of your life from being somebody who scored 700 or less on your SATs to being this uber performer that you are? And each and every one of them could tell the authors with explicit recollection, the sunlight was cascading through the window. I was wearing a pair of, glasses and a blue shirt. They could tell you exactly what happened when somebody stopped and said, "Oh, you're pretty good at that. Wow, I had no idea you could be such a, that you drew so well." Or I had no idea that you were such a gifted athlete. Or I had no idea you could sing so well. These are individuals that are so ravenous for positive affirmation that one term delivered by a coach, a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a teacher was enough to change their life trajectory. So going back to the ABCDE model, I actually attribute those moments where people stopped to recognize and articulate the skills they observed in students with dyslexia to be disputative on a huge magnitude. And those individuals were so energized by that disputative counter evidence that it literally changed their life trajectory. So while Seligman prescribes that ABC model to sort of immunizing yourself to pessimism and learned helplessness, I would take it one step further and saying within that is the secret to energizing and propelling an individual to heights that they may not have even dreamed of. So I was faced with this wonderful challenge, which was now I knew something that I could share with my son in such a way that would allow him to both create a shield of armor going into the academic world, but also I could articulate what he was doing well as he was growing up so that he could balance that negative commentary with positive self-affirmation that would allow him to at least stay neutral, or best case scenario, start to feel good, positive, and confident about himself. Now, I know we had a little bit of technical difficulties in the beginning, so I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. I'm happy to share them with the audience after the conversation if you'd like. But I recognized at that moment that simply saying to my son, "Hey, bud, you're a great little, hockey player," or whatever, wasn't going to necessarily be a sustainable prescription, but I had to recognize all the other ingredients that would go into supporting that disputation and energization. So the first thing I recognized, based on two extraordinary sources, most specifically the NCLD, as well as this long national longitudinal transition study, was there's two ingredients that was most significant in contributing to neurodiverse student success. Number one, there was supportive teachers who understand their neurodiversity. That's all of you here on this line. Kudos. Step one. Step two was having close relationships with mentors that would allow them to feel engaged in their academic environment. So that said to me that if I was going to do something for my son, this could be theoretically translated to all students with dyslexia. And furthermore, it could this was a pie in the sky notion when I started the organization 10 years ago. Perhaps I could create almost like a systemic 700 Club moment by providing it to teachers so that they could be that disputative voice in the mind and ear of the young student who is spiraling towards learned helplessness. Here in the United States, the new big thing, and that blows my mind because social emotional learning is like being human 1.0, right? Is how do you self regulate? How do you identify what your skill sets are, contribute them to team environments, negotiate, actively listen, and resolve conflict healthfully? I recognize that social emotional learning was one of those languages that needed to be inserted into the brains of young dyslexics so that they could both understand the stigma that they were starting to acquire associated with the challenges of their learning differences, but also be able to self-regulate themselves through that frustration, and then also recognize the attributes that would allow them to contribute as they started to feel that empowerment, to harness the power that they were going to inevitably find as we started to whisper in their ear about what they did well at. So, social emotional learning, coupled with those disputative moments, I recognized if we could codify it into curricula. And one of the things that I failed to mention about the dyslexic advantage is the last third of the book is devoted to those professions where dyslexics are disproportionately successful. There's a lot of them, but the four that I was most attracted to was entrepreneurship, engineering, architecture, and the arts. And so I thought to myself, if we can use that context, that pre-professional context, to introduce those MIND strengths, those disputative points, and we could deliver it in a way that allowed students to acquire that social emotional learning and taught them through universal design learning. What does that mean? I'm sorry, I just drew through like 12 hardcore academic buzzwords at you. I apologize. But the point being is that as a dyslexic, if I need to change a tire on my car, I don't go for the manual in my glove compartment. I go to YouTube, right? Why? Because that modality of instruction is something that is organic to my learning style. So why wouldn't we teach kids using audio, video, graphic, pictorial imagery, not to say that reading is not necessary? It is, full stop. But to give students the opportunity to engage in authentic learning through the modality of their choice is critical to success for dyslexics, and also, thank goodness, happens to be the cornerstone of universal design learning. So a very long story short, and I am kind of coming up on it, and I do want to get some questions and answers, but what we have created at Notice Ability, and I love speaking to fellow English speakers because you can hear the double entendre, right? Notice ability, no disability. What we tried to do with the help of Harvard and Boston University is create curricula that could be shared with public schools, private schools, youth serving organizations, NGOs around the world that would, first and foremost, provide teachers with a tool that was easy to insert in their classroom, required very little training on their behalf, because I understand the burden of training on teachers seems endless, but more importantly, allows those teachers to deploy these curricula, transition into that mentoring position where they understand both the challenges and the attributes of dyslexia so that children feel understood, they feel engaged in the classroom, and they're getting that disputative evidence of what it is they do well in, and simultaneously are absorbing the social emotional tools that will help build resilience, position them for genuine self confidence and self esteem, and ultimately, we hope, reduce attrition rates, drug and alcohol rates, and incarceration rates. So I was most recently in New Zealand for pleasure. I'm coming back to New Zealand because I didn't get to New Zealand during a 2 year 22 country tour that my wife, son, and I just completed a year ago, where we went into these countries. We worked with partners in the field. We would demonstrate how our curricula is deployed in the classroom, and we would engage educators so that they were ready to use our tools in their classroom. And the most wonderful thing was, because I was able to convince some generous donors in the United States, all of those services were entirely for free. Because at the end of the day, while I may be an American, I am global enough in my understanding to recognize that my people come in different genders, races, nationalities. They are all my dyslexic siblings, each and every one of them. And there is nothing more inspiring than when I'm working with a group of kids in Kenya and they're talking about innovation to mitigate rainwater flooding, and then I'm in the Netherlands, and then I'm in Seychelles, and all these kids think exactly the same way, which is absolutely brilliant. And yet, each and every one of them has that heartbreaking look in their eye where they are riddled with self doubt and trepidation. And so, it is literally one of the greatest honors I've ever been given to take the work of Seligman and Brocken Fernet Eide and my personal experience and my son as my sort of inspiration behind all of this, and the pain and the the fictitious misunderstanding I had of myself as a youth, and blend it all together and create something that has demonstrated that we can increase student self-esteem, academic tenacity, and improve the level of their stigma consciousness so that they can combat the self-talk that tells them they're useless, or the stigma that others may put upon them, and say, yeah, I may struggle with reading, my spelling may be terrible, punctuation will never be my strong suit, but I've got a business plan and I'm 12. Or, yeah, check out my art, you can see it on YouTube. Okay, that is the disputative energization that we hope to see. So here's just a couple of sort of follow up information for us, but I much prefer to answer questions, because you can imagine how tired I am of hearing myself by now. So um, I'm gonna stop my screen share.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. What a unique perspective on dyslexia and the advantages. Whilst I like your caution that you expressed, we don't necessarily want to go too far down the superpower route. However, there are, those really unique strengths that we can harness. Can I check a couple of things for clarity with you? You were talking about supporting kids to find, and you're the whisper in the ear of that disputational evidence. That phrase is now embedded in my brain as something fantastic we can support kids with. And you just mentioned YouTube, see my art on YouTube. When with our very young kids who are struggling with that learned helplessness, so dyslexic, otherwise neurodivergent, our gifted kids often feel the same. They feel like they are broken just because they are so different. They get to, there's something wrong with me. Where do we start with that disputational evidence? What's if you're a teacher who is like, right, I want to be evidencing away in these kids' ears, not this week because it's school holidays, we're all relaxed on the couch. Where's the best place to start, do you think, for finding and inserting that disputational evidence?
Look, it's easy for me to say because I'm not a traditional educator, but I think the assumption is that none of us went into the educational space for fame and fortune. We went in order to contribute to the creation of a future workforce, future, social representation. And then we got into it and recognized that there's assessments, there's benchmarks, there's mandatory requirements, and that can be quite stifling, especially when your heart came in to inspire, and then you recognize how many things are, shall we say, less than inspiring that you're responsible for. So again, easier for me to say because I'm not a traditional educator, but I think that there's a level of energization that actually we as adults feel when we challenge ourselves to sort of puncture the veil of day-to-day operations and look beyond. And little Jimmy, we know that little Jimmy, he's the kid that shows up and he says, look, I don't have my homework, but let me tell you why. First, there was this bus and then there was this dog. And you go, Jimmy, wow, you know what? Part of me says you got to get your homework on time. And that is true. But you're demonstrating something very persuasive. Your argument is really well crafted. I mean, I don't buy it. You still got to get your homework, but it's really genius. And you know what? Salespeople do that all the time. Jimmy, you got a gift there, buddy. Now let's talk about getting your homework on time, right? Now you're approaching, something from two angles, complimenting what deserves to be complimented, but also keeping feet to the fire, as we say. So I think that just challenge is to look for the best in every student and then compound that with what we need them to do. Marry those two if at all possible. That requires superhuman patience. I'm not saying it comes easy. I mean, I'm speaking from a dad. I'm kind of translating through my dad ears, and I think it's a burden that we place, and unfortunately, we should be paid vast amounts of money and have parades about teachers every single day of the week because we're really doing the most important work and it requires arguably the greatest amount of patience.
Yeah, I could not agree more. That idea of the looking beyond, that the immediate issue was the lack of homework, but actually giving that space and time and that thoughtful time in that teacher's brain to listen and look beyond that obvious thing. We have a couple of other questions. I'm just going to try and summarize, folks. We have a question about kids who are perhaps, so if you imagine a class full of children and some will use, for instance, a reader-writer function. Some will be drawing, some will be building, some will be creating. We have a question about learners being resistant to try something different from perhaps their expectations. So the expectation might be that I'm at school, therefore I do reading and writing. And as a teacher, when you're presenting something a little bit more creative, or there's a few different options, sometimes those children with that learned helplessness go, no, I'm at school to read and write. And why would you what am I doing with all of this stuff? How do we support them in kind of breaking through that initial resistance or fear, or thinking about, oh, I'm doing this, people might think I'm a bit different? What kind of social and emotional support do you think might work for those kids?
I met a gentleman who started a company called Kinko's, which is a copying store, and he's now a billionaire with dyslexia. And what I am reading his book, or I'm listening to his book, and the things that he talks about how he built his company, it was so audacious because he completely abandoned um, business school, reading and writing, and he just said, like, the way we incorporated voicemail, I would leave 40 voicemails for my different managers, and they have to listen to them, but they go through it. And what I admired is that he didn't feel tethered to the constraints of tradition, and here I am as a person with dyslexia who's fairly effective in my life, and yet even I had the trepidation to fully embrace different modalities of expression. And even with my team, I will be reluctant to deliver content in a way that feels native to me. I wouldn't leave 40 voicemails because I think they would just hand in their resignation. But I guess as teachers, demonstrating, not all the time, but demonstrating different modalities of instruction as the leaders of the class. And the number one thing that every teacher ever used to say when drawing something on the classroom is, hey, I'm no artist, so don't judge my picture. But then they would draw it, and I'd be like, that's so cool, thank you so much. I don't care that it's a stick figure. You're doing something that I like inherently know and understand better than the written word. So I guess there's also a level of humility, and I don't know if I'm doing this too much with my son, but I think that the perception from young kids towards adults is they have the answer key, the adults have the answer key, and we've got to figure out the answer key if we're going to be like them one day. And so the more that we can be human, and like just that throwaway term, I'm no artist, so don't judge my picture, and then do it. It's like you're saying, wow, okay, you have self doubt about one aspect of your credential, but you have the courage to go and do it in that way. Now, all of a sudden, there's that familiarity with your humanness. And I, as a young child, am now trusting you because you're not demonstrating invulnerability and perfection. You're demonstrating a little window into insecurity. You're willing to do something you're not necessarily great at. And I think that curries so much favor and trust. And I think if kids trust you, I really think if kids trust you, they will then open up the rose petal of vulnerability. They'll tell you what they need, they'll invite you into their lives. And there's a lot of disenfranchised students that we all have to deal with. And when one of them cracks and reveals their inner workings, for me at least, it's like they've infused me with so much energy because I know I'm able to reach them and they trust me. So I don't know. I guess maybe just being human, being a little bit less professional, not compromising your standards, but being willing to look a little bit less professional by being a little bit goofy, um, might engender trust.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. And I think as teachers, we do actually like being human in the classroom. We like bringing our whole authentic selves, to the room
Yeah.
rather than robotically. We have a question about the social and emotional support. So we've had lots of success in this country with gifted programs in particular that build through social and emotional support. And I'm just checking in, you were saying that the same concept about social and emotional support for students with dyslexia. And I am going to extend that thinking to more broadly neurodivergent students, those who are teetering on that edge of learnt helplessness, you were saying is a great thing. And I love how you describe social and emotional learning as being human 1.0. I think that's fantastic. But is that what you're recommending, advocating? Like, how do you see that fit together?
Social emotional learning, in my opinion, is such a broad topic and it's so personalized, right? What one child needs is can be so vastly different than what another needs. And, there's, I, I don't I don't necessarily have to deal with 30 students on a day-to-day basis. So much of my advice is has the benefit of not being tethered to those day-to-day operations. And it would be very different if I did, because I think I would feel a lot more frustration and probably exhibit some learned helplessness as a teacher at times, because sometimes no matter what you do, nobody responds. I think there's also I don't know, I repeat your question one more time, because I'm about to go in three different tangents and I don't want to go.
The For clarity, you're advocating for social and emotional learning for students with dyslexia, much like many of us currently put in place for students who are gifted. Yes?
Yes,
Correct? Yeah.
yes.
And in particular, what would you say are some key focal points for that social and emotional learning? Because, like you say, it's a big area.
I think again, it depends on the presentation of the individual student. I think that many of the students will either retreat into one of three different personas, right? They'll be completely withdrawn and shut down. They'll be acting out as a behavioral issue, which is really just a mislabeled, undiagnosed learning issue that underscores that, or they'll be, the charming salesman, right? And they some of them will toggle through those, and then trying to identify, what is the reciprocal of what they're exhibiting, right? So if a child is that class clown or even rude, the impulse, I think, is you detention right now, as opposed to trying to steer that emotional sort of quagmire that they're going through, and actually saying after class, listen, there was a couple of things that rubbed me the wrong way, and my impulse was to send you to Mr. So and so, but the reality is I think that there might be something going on that I would love to help you with, if there is something you're willing to share with me. And they probably won't even buy into you at that moment, but the fact is that you've expressed a desire to do something different than the impulse that they're actually kind of seeking, right? Because it's easier to go to the disciplinary office than it is to be called out in their minds as being the dumb kid. So I don't. I guess it's a bit. I mean, I guess we should all be a psychologist to some degree in order to try to understand it, right? But then it also makes the assumption that we have figured out all of our own
Mhm.
psychological disposition, which is certainly not the case. It's a really tough one without addressing it case by case. But I think if you look at the central tenets of social emotional learning and what we have done, let me put it quite quickly back to you, is that in our courses, all of our courses are team based activities, and all of our modules have both content on entrepreneurship or engineering, but also have a specific lesson on a social emotional tool. And then what we do while students are working in teams is that the teacher is designed to be a scaffolding participant, sort of a coach on the sidelines, as opposed to the sage on the stage. And at the end of each class, they have a metric by which to award seed capital in our entrepreneurship class, or NASA credits in our engineering class. The point is, it's a reward system, but it's not predicated on how good your idea or how smart you're being, but more, have you been able to work as a team, listen to each other? Oh, I saw you all got into that disagreement about X, Y, or Z, but you listened to each other. You didn't raise your voice. You listened and then reiterated back what you heard and then compromised effectively. You guys get $20,000 in seed capital today because you work so effectively as a team. That seems to do a really magical thing to student brain. They're all geared up for competition and reward winning through video games and stuff like that. So let's translate it a little bit to the classroom and incentivize the behavior, not based on content reiteration, but on social emotional interaction.
Amazing. I think that flip is something we can do as teachers really easily and has huge potential straight away that actually it signals to kids, this is the important stuff of what's going on here today. This is the stuff that I'm noticing as a teacher. This is the stuff where I want you to really be shining. So that is such a fantastic and straightforward flip, I think, that teachers can make straight away. A couple more questions if you have a couple more minutes. So I'm just conscious of the time.
It's a nice sunny evening. I'm good to go. I see
Amazing.
questions. I can't read and answer at the same time, but I see
No,
there's
no,
some
no.
questions I'd be happy to
I'll
answer.
translate as much as I can.
Thank you.
So we have a question about how we support kids in finding their passions. We certainly know in our work at the centre with working with gifted and neurodiverse kids that some kids arrive with us knowing full well they love XYZ. They're just absolutely passionately captured by something, and other kids arrive going, don't really know. Do you have any tips for supporting those dyslexic learners in particular who I suspect might start to feel disengaged and that learned helplessness creeps in when you say, okay, what are you actually passionate about? They're starting, that downward slide. Does that make sense? So do you have any strategies for that?
Yeah. I think look, I don't like the position that often teachers and parents become adversarial because especially with gifted or neurodiverse students, the parents always want more. The teachers are trying their best, don't feel appreciated. And what I say to parents is, you get more flies with honey than you do whatever the expression goes. I think one of the greatest ways you can engage and find those passion points, or as my wife refers to it, where a child loses time, right?
Yeah.
When you get called to dinner because they're doing the painting and they just can't. Asking parents, and parents may have insight that they don't have. Parents will also be like, "Wow, Miss Julia was so proactive about finding what Jimmy likes to do after school." I think it starts to develop a really positive foundation between parents and teachers and puts them on the same page, as opposed to the potential of having them conflicting. But they're sometimes, I mean, they look at perfect thing is student is doodling on the side of their page. Well, it's easy to reprimand them, or it's easy to say, wow, so I didn't know you're an artist. And now all of a sudden, you say, well, look, first of all, I want to make sure that you understand the notes. If they're in doodle form, that's fine. I want to make sure you got the material for later. But also, do you know that Miss Smith is a really exceptional art teacher? Have you been to her class yet? Right. And now all of a sudden you're giving that disputative moment, that energization. You're also making clear that the child is actually getting the content they need to get and is accountable for what you're trying to teach them. You're also not making it a punitive scenario when you shouldn't be doodle, you should be writing what I say. I think you can
Yeah.
navigate.
Fantastic. That is, I think, engaging parents. You're right. They know. And those are the things that are sometimes hidden from us as teachers. And I agree that really supports that connected relationship instead of the parents and teachers can get a bit rubbing the wrong way together. I'm just going to fire one more question at you, and it's about mentorship. So the question is about how we help our kids connect with mentors, how we as teachers can find those mentors, those people who are great for our kids to be with, and how we promote those connections. So any tips on that one will be super appreciated.
Yeah, and I don't know. I thought I saw something maybe in reference to Maori at some point. Maybe I was imagining that. I think that, we're surrounded by mentors. I think that at least the American tendency is to be like, well, who's the best at something or other? That's so silly, right? I mean, look, if your child takes apart the lawnmower all the time, that means that they are a budding engineer, right?
Yeah.
You got a mechanical garage in every town. Be like, hey, can my son sit in and watch you guys change carburetors this afternoon? Yeah, maybe that's not a NASCAR engineering, department, but it's somebody who can show your kid how to change a carburetor. And that's fostering that sense of passion. So, I mean, look, until somebody is like Olympic bound, I don't think you need an Olympic quality mentor. Mentors are everywhere, right? If like, hey, Jimmy, look, the song and dance you gave me about not doing your homework, fantastic salesmanship. Get your homework done next time. Sent. Have you visited Bill's mom, who is an exceptional number one car salesman in town? Just go and listen to how she sells a car. It's arguably the most difficult thing to do in the world. Just
Mm.
sit at her desk and see how she does it. And then that little student's like, I know how much she made off that sale of that car. I'm sticking with school because if I don't get my high school degree, I can't sell cars. Great context.
Yeah.
Do it. We're
Amazing.
surrounded by mentors. As long
Fantastic.
as you trust them and they're stand up men or women, that's great.
Yeah. I'll just share a story on that you reminded me of. We have a student that we've been working with who has an obsession with vacuum cleaners, knows everything that is humanly possible to know about vacuum cleaners, finds them intensely interesting. At any point in time, you can say, hey, tell me about how it works, anything, tell me anything. And there's a new fun fact about vacuum cleaners. So his mentor started off as the person who runs the local vacuum cleaner store, who very quickly ran out of ideas for this particular child. So they connected him with manufacturers and said, okay, you need to go and talk to these people at whoever it was, because they knew, so they could onward connect this child. So yes, I agree. It's absolutely just finding the person in the real world who can have those conversations about vacuum cleaners that we can't
I
always have with kids.
look, if anybody who's ever had to buy a vacuum cleaner recently understands it's a absolutely gargantuan expense for a
Yeah.
vacuum cleaner. So if that kid's developing innovative vacuum cleaners, we're all going to be answering to him one day, right?
uh,
I mean, that's like a
100%.
world class. Look, at the end of the
Amazing.
day, and just if I may, in closing thoughts, the fact that we're here this morning is evidence that we are dedicated to either our students or our children, whatever relationship you may have, and they're going to observe our dedication. Whether or not they recognize it right now, something deep in the back of their mind knows that you care enough to be looking, to be learning, to be seeking out ways to support them, and that translates. And ultimately, at some point in their life, they may not remember your name, your classroom, but they will attribute what they have become to somebody who believed in them way back when. So the results may not be immediate, but that's the beauty of education, is that we are playing into a variable that can positively affect multiple generations. Let's just try. The worst we can do is do nothing. So let's keep trying.
Absolutely, 100%. Thank you so much for giving up your time on
Thank
a
you.
Sunday evening. We
Thank you.
super appreciate it. We are going to make the recording and the resources that you mentioned available to all the people who have registered. We are now moving into a little morning tea break. So do feel free, everyone, to, because it's not evening where we are, Dean. It's morning tea time. So grab your coffee, have a cup of tea or biscuit or whatever it is you need. And we will see you back shortly. Maria has joined us, who is one of our young neurodiversity champions. And Maria is going to share her experiences of what it's like when your strengths are recognised or not recognised, and how they are developed in schools or should be developed in schools. So we're super looking forward to it. Thank you again so much, Dean. It's just been so fantastic and uplifting as teachers
So
knowing
grateful.
we can
So
make
grateful. And I'll share that slide deck if anybody's
it.
interested.
That would be great.
Thank you
Thank you
so much.
so much.
Have a great
Bye-bye.
week. Cheers.
Okay, folks, for morning tea time, I'm just going to video off and we'll see you back here in a few minutes. Thanks, everyone. See you soon. See you soon, Maria.